Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Encouraging Customers to Conserve Pricing and Non-Pricing Approaches. My name is Tess Clark. I work here at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. And just before we get started with our program, I'm going to quickly go over some logistics and just talk briefly about the Environmental Finance Center Network and our Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. Right, I'm happy to report that we have a diverse audience for today's webinar. You can see that we have attendees from all over the world joining us today, and it's a very impressive turnout. We have about 300 people registered. Regarding credits for this webinar, registered attendees can receive a certificate of attendance for participating. This webinar hasn't been submitted to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits, so you will need to self-submit in order to receive any available credit. We recommend that you check with your licensing agency to learn what you need to do in order to get credit for your attendance. It's your responsibility to verify this information. Your certificate will be emailed to you within 30 days of the webinar date, and you can utilize this document to self-submit if you choose to. If you need help or assistance, you can contact Bill Whips. His email is listed below on this slide. It's www.whips@syr.edu. Some information about the Environmental Finance Center Network. This is a session that's been conducted by our network for the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. The EFCM provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all 50 states and 5 territories to help local water systems achieve and maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Okay, and here you can take a look at our small systems team. Our network extends across the U.S. We have partners in all regions that you can take a look at here. And here you can see some of our areas of expertise. We focus on workshops, trainings, and direct technical assistance on the following topics: energy management, water loss reduction, asset management, rate setting and fiscal planning, and all listed above. The EFCN also has a small systems blog. You can learn more about water finance and management through this blog. The posts feature lessons learned from our trainings, descriptions of available tools, and also success stories. At the end of this webinar, you will get the opportunity to subscribe if you so wish. In addition to the workshops, direct technical assistance, and webinars, as part of our Smart Management for Small Water Systems project, we've been creating tables that list the major funding sources for drinking water infrastructure projects for each state and territory. This is how you would access those tables. On our homepage, you can go to the Resources tab and then click Funding Sources by State, as you can see in the slide. This will take you to a map of the country. If you click on the state you're interested in, you will find a PDF of the table relevant to funding sources for drinking water for that state. The table looks like the image on the left of the slide. For each funding program, it includes the name of the program, a short description, and contact information for someone who works there. Okay, and before I turn the presentation over to our expert today, I have 2 quick polling questions for you. So the first question I'm going to be launching now. So just take a look here and respond the best you can. What kind of water and or sewer utility do you represent? Select one of the following: for-profit, local government, not-for-profit, other water systems such as authority, district, school, etc., or not a water system. Okay, I'm just going to give you a few more seconds here to respond. Looks like we're almost all the way complete. All right, I'm closing this poll. Great, so here you can see the results. Looks like most of our folks today are from local government, municipal or county water systems. We also have a bunch of people who are not water systems, but a fair amount of folks who are for-profit systems, not-for-profit, and also authority, district, or schools. Okay, just one more poll before we get started. All right, what size water and or sewer system does your utility operate? And just choose the one that makes the most sense for your system. Very small, small, medium, large or very large, or not a water system. All right, just take a couple more minutes here to pick that response that works best for you. All right, I'm closing this poll now. Okay, great. And also some diversity of responses here. It looks like we have a lot of folks who are representing very large water systems, and also a fair amount of folks who, again, aren't a water system, but some rather even spread between small systems, small or medium. All right. Well, at this point, I'm going to hand it over to our presenter today. Glenn Barnes is Associate Director of the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he's here today to go over pricing and non-pricing conservation approaches. Glenn, I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Tess, and good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be joining you for our webinar today. As Tess mentioned, I'm Glenn Barnes, Associate Director of the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina. I'm happy to be with you and to talk about pricing and non-pricing approaches to promoting conservation. So we'll dive in on the material now. First off, what I want to talk about is that encouraging conservation is one of a series of water system objectives that we often talk about in our work. If you've ever been to one of our workshops or perhaps listened in on a webinar we did a little bit earlier in the year on full cost recovery pricing. So encouraging conservation fits in alongside full cost recovery, fostering business-friendly practices, maintaining affordability. It is one of the main objectives that we see water systems have in terms of how they set their rates, how they operate their system. And we're obviously going to focus in on encouraging conservation today, but I'll talk a little bit about at the end about how that goal and some of these other objectives can sometimes conflict with each other. So why would a water system want to encourage conservation? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is just simply a lack of source water. I was out in New Mexico a couple of weeks ago doing a workshop on this topic in Santa Fe. We had a lot of small systems in attendance, and some of them have growing populations, but New Mexico is a pretty dry state overall. And so there are parts of the country where there is just a lack of source water. It could have to do with water rights in the western half of the country, where conservation is really important because there's not a lot of water to begin with. Second point is a growing population. We often see systems that are having to serve more and more people over time. My home state here in North Carolina is a pretty rapidly growing state in terms of population. Many of you are from parts of the country that are growing. And so as more and more people need to be served by our systems, conserving water by the current customers could help stretch that supply out to serve more customers, especially business customers. You may have a system nearing the storage or treatment capacity. So conservation is the cheaper alternative to having to drill a new well or build a new wastewater treatment plant or a new overhead storage tank, whatever the case may be. Conservation may be necessary to, again, kind of stretch the limits of the available water supply. I mentioned New Mexico, being a fairly dry state to begin with, but they're also in the midst right now of a pretty bad drought. And so certainly drought conditions, even in water-rich states, can have a severe impact on water supply and might be a driver for conservation. And then, of course, I don't want to forget just the environmental benefits associated with conservation. We're stewards of a precious and limited resource in the world, and we want to maintain it and use it in a wise way. And so these are some of the main reasons when we interact with water systems that they tell us that they want to encourage conservation. So we're going to do just a couple of quick polling questions for you here related to this conservation objective. So Tess, go ahead and please launch the first of those questions.
Great, so it looks like a lot of people have already responded. We're going to give you a few more seconds just to get your answers in here. Make sure you are answering the question, is encouraging conservation important to your water system? And just select yes, no, or not from a water system. Okay, great. I'm going to be closing this poll in just a few seconds. All right, poll is now closed. And here are the results. As you can see, of our water systems, overwhelmingly, people said yes, conservation is important. A few people said no, and a couple people are not from a water system.
All right, and it's not surprising to see that conservation is important to many of you, so we're going to launch a second polling question now just to say, well, how important is it relative to other objectives?
Great. So please do your best here to rank encouraging conservation on a list with full cost pricing, business-friendly practices, and maintaining affordability. Make sure that if you think it's your most important thing, click the first, it's our top priority. If encouraging conservation is important, but it's not the most important, it's your second important, click number 2, it's our second highest important priority. Or if it's your third, please select that option as well. Okay, so it looks like almost everyone has responded here. I'm going to give you a few more minutes, or sorry, seconds to respond, and then I'm going to close this poll. All right. Okay, I'm closing this poll. Here's your results. Great, so it looks like of our water systems, 20% of you, it's not your top priority, it's your lowest priority. 23%, it's your third highest. Your second highest option is for about 19% of our respondents, and the top priority for about 7% of the respondents today.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for those responses. It's just interesting to see. I mean, conservation is important to most of you, but compared to other objectives, it can sometimes butt heads a little bit. And I think that we're going to talk about that in terms of some of the impacts that promoting conservation can have on the bottom line. So there are two different ways that we can approach conservation as a water system. One is pricing signals, and we're going to spend the second half of the webinar focusing on those. But what I want to begin with are the non-price strategies. These are going to be the decrees or laws or incentive programs, whatever they may be, that will help your system promote conservation, but without having it tied specifically to the rates. And so the first thing that I want to mention is that at a system level, you have an option of looking at conservation when you're doing water auditing. And if you've not listened in on our webinars or attended any of our workshops on water audits and non-revenue water, I highly encourage you to do that. If you have, this chart will probably look familiar, which is your water audit balance from AWWA. And the area that I've highlighted in yellow at the bottom, the real losses, the leaks from your mains, your service lines, and your tank overflows, if you are limiting these real losses, that is a way of encouraging conservation at a system level. But I think for most of us, when we think about water loss or we think about conservation, what we're really thinking about is focusing on a customer level, whether that be a residential or non-residential customer. And so there are 4 general strategies that we're going to go over here: increasing customer information, helping customers reduce usage, alternative sources for outdoor irrigation, and then usage restrictions. So the first one, increasing customer information. The idea here is that the more information customers have about their usage and how that usage rates compared to or benchmarks against expected usage will help customers understand and control their use better. So one of the easiest ways to do this, which many of you do already, is to use monthly billing. And so we see this around the country, that a lot of times when systems switch from, say, quarterly or bi-monthly billing to monthly billing, customers are able to get more immediate feedback on their usage. They can cut back on their usage to some degree. It's also very important to help customers find leaks very quickly. You may want to, on that bill, also provide price and historic usage information. We've seen a lot of good examples of this, and this helps customers understand how they're paying for water. You can have on that bill as well a comparison of customer usage to local averages. This is something we see quite a bit in the electricity sector, and we're seeing it a little bit more in the drinking water sector as well. If you have some good examples of this, please let me know. Would love to see some sample bills that do this. You can, again, in the vein of increasing customer information, sub-meter for multifamily units. So if you have a large apartment building or a property where multiple households are on a single meter, you can sub-meter to give each of those individual units a little bit better sense of their individual water use compared to the whole. That may not necessarily mean that you're going to bill at that level, but it might be helpful to at least measure and report out that kind of usage. And then finally, one strategy is just posting public conservation notices. Again, from when I was in Santa Fe a couple weeks ago, and at our training venue, there was a notice in the bathroom that talked about water as a precious resource, and whether you're from Santa Fe or just visiting, please help us conserve. And at the bottom, I noticed it said, you know, posted pursuant to, and it had a statute reference. And I looked it up, and in fact, Santa Fe has an ordinance that these types of signs need to be posted in public facilities, which I thought was pretty interesting. So that's one strategy, increasing the amount of information that your customers have. And there's a really great website through the EPA Water Sense program that's linked here. You'll get it when we email the slides out about understanding your water bill. And they have a lot of good samples of bills and some of the practices that we talked about. Okay, so that's one strategy. A second strategy is that we're going to, as utilities, incentivize or help our customers reduce their usage. So that could be through some type of discount program or rebate program around low-flow toilets, faucets, shower heads, dishwashers, washing machines, commercial kitchen programs. We've seen a lot of examples of these. Some are available to all customers. Some are available only to low-income customers, so it's their customer assistance program. We have seen some programs around the country where utilities and water systems are actually helping customers fix leaks. I think you know, those of us who work in the business kind of know how quickly water use can accumulate, especially if you have something like a leaking toilet. I know the first time I had a leaking toilet in my house, I was stunned that it was leaking at a rate of almost 3,000 gallons a day, which was about equivalent to my monthly usage. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about it in that particular way, so helping customers fix leaks is an option. And then we also see a lot of programs, in particular, there have been a lot of these in California over the past couple of years when the state had to respond to the severe drought that they had over the last 3 or 4 years, where there are programs to reduce outdoor water use. That could be lawn buyback programs or programs to incentivize replacing vegetation with low water or landscaping, or what's called xeriscaping, landscaping that doesn't require any watering. We see programs to reduce evaporation, including, you know, discounts on pool covers and things like that. So there are a lot of different types of incentive programs that utilities have set up around the country where essentially they are trying to make it easier for their customers to use less water. So this is the second approach we wanted to highlight. And again, if you're looking for examples of these rebate programs, that same WaterSense website has this really great rebate finder tool. So you would type in the type of rebate you're looking for and maybe the geographic area. It will pull up programs with links to them. So we got to learn about a lot of great programs, both from small water systems and larger systems around the country from the site. The third strategy I wanted to talk about is alternative sources for outdoor irrigation. So, you know, in the last one, we talked about how to limit outdoor irrigation, but there are ways to actually find non-potable sources of water to use for that. That could be rainwater, discharge water from water treatment, or treated wastewater. And then another strategy are rain barrels, programs to give discounts or incentivize people to use rain barrels to collect rainwater to do this outdoor irrigation. Now you'll notice the scales of justice symbol on the slide. That's just a reminder to check your state and local ordinances or territorial ordinances on this, because in some places using rain barrels or using some of these other water sources is limited in terms of the legality, but we wanted to put this out here because we do see these types of programs around the country. And finally, there's the strategy of restricting outdoor usage. So this could be all the time. The water system where my mother lives in South Florida has restrictions on the days of the week in which they can do outdoor irrigation and the times of day that that can happen. And so we see many water systems have these types of restrictions in place all the time. But we also see in some cases that customers are limited in usage during times of low water supply or drought. So it could be tied to drought conditions, or it could be tied to the actual level of surface water, or a drought level as issued by the federal government, or some percentage of the water rights being used. So we see these restrictions come into place. Again, the hours of watering, the time of day, the days of the week, etc., that are sometimes there all the time and other times only there during times of low water supply. And then finally, if you're going to have any of these types of outdoor restrictions, or really any of these programs, what's important is enforcing these mandates. So we see lots of water systems that have outdoor restrictions in place, but then they don't enforce them, and as people find out about that, then that water use tends to not go down very much. So we want to pull up a poll question for you here about just some of your non-pricing strategies. We're curious about which ones are being used by our listeners. So we've got a poll question opening up right now.
Great. So make sure that you're reading the question. Do you use any of the following non-pricing approaches to encourage conservation? And just click any of the responses that apply to you. Water use restriction always, water use restrictions during drought, low supply times, non-potable water for irrigation, low flow device discounts, or fixing real water loss. Okay, and we're just going to keep this open for a few more seconds. It looks like people are still voting, so I'll give you a couple more seconds to vote. All right, I am closing this poll now. Right, great. So it looks like of our water systems, we have an overwhelming number of you are using water restrictions during drought or low supply times, 58%. And then we have a fair number of folks who are using low flow device discounts and giveaways, and also some people, a fair number, 16%, using non-potable water for irrigation, and 12% are using water use restrictions always.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody, and it's good to see those results. For those of you who are from small water systems who have responded, you may be getting a call from me to follow up on a couple of those programs. We're always looking for some good examples. So, you know, many of you are familiar with these types of non-pricing approaches for conservation, and as we saw, many of you are using them. So you might think, all right, easy, done. We've talked about conservation, quickest webinar ever. It's 25 after the hour. We can go relax for the next 30 minutes. We're finished. Well, no, because as you know, there's an issue. And the issue is that we are in the business of selling water. So we are water systems. We have that good environmental mindset and being good stewards of natural resources, et cetera. But, you know, many of you are local government systems. You are enterprise funds, most likely. You need to be self-supporting. Most of our revenue is coming from the rates that we charge our customers. So we're in the business of selling water. And if we want customers to use less water, what impact does that have on our revenues? And what impact does that have on our costs? So we want to just take a couple of minutes and dive into this, because I think this is really important, and why these types of non-pricing approaches, while they can be very effective at encouraging conservation, can have some negative impacts financially on water systems. So the first is, let's just do a quick review of types of costs. So you have operating costs. This is what you need to run your system day in and day out. This is going to be things like salaries and benefits, repairs on systems, paying the cost of taxes and insurance, paying for your auditor, paying for testing, sending your employees to training, getting them certified. just electricity, chemicals, power costs, all the day-to-day things we need to run the water system are our universe of operating costs. Then we have our capital costs. This is the rehabilitation and replacement of our existing water infrastructure, and then any new infrastructure that we need to build. And then finally, if you've borrowed money for your water system, you have debt service, what you owe on loans and bonds. And what's important to think about with these different types of costs is that some of these costs are what we would consider fixed. And that does not mean that they are always the same, but what it means is that they do not change regardless of the volume of water that we treat and sell. So an example of this would be our debt service. That cost is the same regardless of how much water we treat and sell in a given month. The same is generally true for salaries. For our employees, which is usually a very large chunk of our overall expenditure, unless you're a volunteer-led system. So a good number of the costs that we have for water systems do not change based on the volume of water treated and sold. And then there are some that vary pretty much exclusively or largely with the amount of water that we treat and sell. And some examples of that might be chemicals that we use for treating water, or the electricity that we use to distribute water around our system. You may have a little bit of electricity costs that are fixed for your office, for example, but most of our power costs will be variable. If you're a purchase water system, how much you purchase can vary based on how much your customers are using. So there are a smaller number of these variable costs, and then some are in between. Some kind of change a little bit based on how much water we treat and sell, but not fully. And so when we think about this graphically, if you think about on the x-axis, gallons of water produced, and on the y-axis, dollars, fixed costs are, just basically going to stay the same regardless of the gallons of water produced. It's going to be that same level no matter what. And the variable cost, a much smaller percentage, will go up as the gallons of water produced go up. So that's the cost side. Now on the revenue side, system income, which is mostly from the rates that we charge our customers, but then also things like tap fees and system development charges, grants that we may get, penalties that we get from customers, other sources. These are the incomes that we have, and then obviously money that we borrow is another type of income. And so the revenue picture, if we look at the same thing, that fixed revenue, the base rate that we charge, is often relatively small in terms of dollars, and then the bulk of the revenue we get is the commodity charge, so what we charge per gallon of usage or CCF of usage. So obviously we have a mismatch here, because if you overlay these two, the fixed costs are much higher than the fixed revenue. So we know that, but we're able to make up for that because the variable revenue is much higher than the variable cost. So we can cover that shortfall with variable revenue, assuming that we price the water appropriately and we sell the right amount of water to our customers. But what happens if that doesn't happen? What happens if instead of this level of revenue coming in from the commodity charge, we get this level of revenue? And then we don't cover the costs. Well, what happens when customers conserve? Often we end up with a revenue shortfall. And I'm putting up on the screen now, this is an actual political cartoon from a newspaper here in North Carolina about 10 or 15 years ago when we had a drought. It's the evil water system, robber baron shaking every last penny out of the poor sap's pocket and saying, when you conserve water, we have a deficit, so I have to raise your rates. And I think to a lot of customers, they find this to be really outrageous. But for those of us in the business, we know that this is the way that we have set up our pricing. And so this is the risk that we often have when we're pricing water in the way that we do, where more of it is coming in on the commodity side than on the base side. So that transitions now to what I want to spend the balance of the hour talking about, which are pricing signals through rates to encourage conservation. And there's a couple of points I want to make here. The first is that there is no single rate structure that can be called a conservation rate structure. There are many that, if priced appropriately and designed appropriately, can encourage conservation, but the devil is really in the details. Now, there are certainly rate structures which do not encourage conservation. If your rate structure is we charge people $20 a month for unlimited water use, that is not going to encourage conservation. And if you have a rate structure where the higher the usage goes, the lower the rate goes, or a decreasing block rate structure, generally that is also not going to encourage conservation. But there are a number of different strategies that and structures that can, and we'll go through several examples of them. But what we have found in looking at pricing and looking at usage in different states across the country in our work is that really the rate level matters much more than the rate structure. And so therefore, you may want to consider higher rates at average usage levels in addition to just high levels if you really want to encourage conservation, but obviously there are some potential affordability concerns there, which we'll talk about. Okay, so the first structure I want to talk about is higher uniform charges. So customers' bills at most utilities and systems are generally driven by usage. So the higher the volumetric charge, and in this case it's every 1,000 gallons or 100 CCF is billed at the same level, there's an incentive to conserve. So this is an example. This is a system from Arizona, and it's a small system, as most of the examples will be today that we'll show you. They have a base fee for residential customers of $25 a month, and then the usage fee is $14.75 per 1,000 gallons. So regardless of the usage level, that's a pretty high rate compared to what we see at many systems around the country. Just for those of you listening in, if you haven't heard me share this story before, the highest rate we've seen, that I've personally seen, is with a water system serving about 100 connections on the east end of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. If you're wondering what's it like to run a water system on a tiny island in the middle of the ocean, their rate is about $8.50 per 100 gallons, or $85 per 1,000 gallons. That is certainly a rate that encourages conservation. Now, we also see a strategy, and Troutman, North Carolina, who I have up here now, is an example of this, where the volumetric charge might be a little bit lower than what we saw for the previous example from Arizona. Here it's $7.72 per 1,000 gallons for water. But in the case of Troutman, they do not have a base charge at all. 100% of their revenue is tied to the volumetric charge. So again, the more water you use, the higher your bill goes up proportionally, and this is a different way that a water system may encourage conservation, is by really putting all of the bill on the volumetric side. Now, if you care about revenue stability as a water system, as I said, some of those objectives we talked about earlier can conflict. This is an example where you're running a little bit of a risk of revenue stability by not having a base charge, but it is an approach that we see. Okay. The next rate structure I want to talk about is increasing block rates, and this is one I think many of you are familiar with, that as usage goes up, the price increases, and that encourages customers to cut back on their usage. So the example on the screen that I pulled up from the Pu'u water system in Hawaii, their first 5,000 gallons is billed at a rate of $13 per 1,000 gallons, and then the next from 5,000 to 15,000 is billed at a higher rate, and then the block above that at a higher rate still, and then the block above that at a higher rate still. So this is a pretty straightforward rate structure, which I think a lot of systems use, that just the more a customer uses, the higher those rates go. Now, we've done some talking about rate setting in the past, and some past webinars about increasing block rates. And it's important that you get the number of blocks right, that you get the differential right between the rates. We've seen some examples where, every 1,000 gallons, the rate goes up by maybe 10 or 15 cents. That's not really kind of encouraging conservation. We want customers to see when they're crossing those lines. But do keep in mind the demographics of your community. If you have a lot of large or multi-generational families living under the same roof, they may have a high overall water use, but a low per capita water use, and this type of rate structure may not encourage a lot of conservation. Now, one example of this that is a little bit different we've seen is from Currituck County, North Carolina, which is a large water system. And the most important line here, if you look on the screen, you say, all right, this looks like a pretty straightforward increasing block rate structure, $20 base charge, including the first 2,000 gallons, and then they have blocks at 5, 10, 15, 20, and so on, and the price goes up. But you have to read this sentence at the bottom. Consumption over 2,000 gallons is billed retroactive to the first gallon used. So what that means is typically if you have an increasing block rate structure, and let's say I use 8,000 gallons, the first 2,000 would be included in the base rate if this were the bill. The next 3,000 would be billed at $4.50 per thousand, and then the next 3,000 would be billed at $5.50 per thousand. But that's not the way Currituck County does it. The way their rate structure works is anything, whatever you top out at, in my case, let's say 8,000 gallons for the month, you pay $5.50 per thousand gallons for all of your usage except for the 2,000 included in the base charge. So it's a little bit of a different spin on how increasing block works. And this is really the only example in the country we've seen that is doing something like this. But if you're doing something like it too, we'd love to talk to you about it and how it's working. All right, so that's increasing block. Next, I want to talk about seasonal rates. So in the water business, depending on where you are in the country, in most places, you will have a season where you're selling more water and a season where you're selling less water. So for most systems, the summer is your high season, but if you're in a winter resort area or a part of the country where you get a lot of winter part-time residents, snowbirds coming down to your community, it may be that winter is your busier season. But essentially what seasonal rates and this structure is that prices are higher during high use times of year, which would encourage conservation, but then they're lower during the lower use times of year. So let me show you an example. This is from Cactus-Stellar Limited water system in Arizona. So October through April, they bill $3 per thousand gallons for their volumetric charge. And then May through September, which is their high water use season, that goes up to $4.60 per 1,000 gallons. So again, this is an example of everybody in the community, not just high users, but everybody pays a higher rate during the summertime when water supplies are more limited. And again, for conservation, part of what you want to think about is, an increasing block is more targeting higher users. A high volumetric rate year-round is targeting all users. This seasonal is targeting all users. We do see seasonal increasing block rates as well. We see some where the winter rate is $3 and the summer rate is $12 per thousand gallons. So we see a lot of variation in these numbers as well. But this is an example of a seasonal rate that we've seen and helped systems set up so that way during those high use times of year, there's a rate structure really designed for promoting conservation. And then we wanted to talk about the idea of metering and charging separately for outdoor water use and irrigation and pricing that water higher than you would for regular water use. And for some water systems, this is essentially just going to be a second meter where the same potable water that is going into the house or business or building is being used outside and billed at a higher rate. Or we also see some examples where there is a separate line running gray water for irrigation, and that is billed at a different rate as well. So depending, there's a couple of different ways to set this up, but essentially you would meter differently for outside water use than you would for household water use. And so here's an example from Stockbridge, Georgia. You see for both residential and their commercial categories, they have increasing block rates. But then they also have an irrigation rate, which per thousand gallons is $10.72. So that's just an example of, they're charging kind of higher rates for those outdoor meters. This approach that Stockbridge is essentially to have a high uniform rate for irrigation, but we also see some examples, and this is Southbridge, North Carolina, where they have, for their irrigation rates, increasing block irrigation rates. So the usage for 0 to 10,000 gallons would be at one rate, and then the usage rates above that would go a little bit higher. So, you know, we do see this is an example of an increasing block irrigation rate. And then finally, from the Marbury water system in Arizona, they do an increasing block rate for irrigation, and they also do a base charge. So just like with your regular rates, in order to guarantee a little bit more revenue stability, this water system has set up both a base rate and a volumetric rate for the irrigation meters that is separate from the one for the household meters that they have. And then finally, I wanted to talk about low supply and drought surcharges. So in this particular instance, prices increase only when the supply of water are limited, encouraging conservation at crucial times. And so one example that I wanted to show, which is an interesting one, is the Tonto Hills Water Improvement District in Arizona. I visited with the system a couple of months ago. They're north of Phoenix in the mountains, really beautiful area. And they get a lot of their water from the Central Arizona Project. So this is really tied into their water rights and their ability to tap into those Central Arizona Project water resources. And so as the percentage of that usable Central Arizona Project allocation goes up, as it gets to 80% and then to 90%, they have different stages of rates. And so if you see here on the screen, so they have an increasing block rate to start with. So they have 5 tiers with rates starting at $6.80 and going up to $12.55 per 1,000 gallons. And then when they get into stage 3 and stage 4, you'll notice that the first 2 tiers, the 0 to 4,000 gallons tier and the 4,000 to 13,000 gallons tier, are unchanged. They're still $6.80 and $10.20 respectively. But then the 3rd tier, 4th tier, and 5th tier have higher rates during these stages. And if you see that 5th tier rate, which is over 30,000 gallons in stage 4 conditions, which is 90% of their Central Arizona Project allocation, that is not a typo. That is $70 per 1,000 gallons is the rate that they're charging. So again, really wanting to encourage conservation. Now, Tonto Hills, this could be tied to a drought, but it's mostly just tied to their water rights and their allocations. But we have certainly seen examples of these types of rates that are specifically tied to, say, the level of the, if you have surface water, the level of the water supply, or how, you know, close the water supply is to the intake line, for example. We have seen these tied to the federal drought levels that have been issued. So we see a lot of different examples of these. And the idea behind these rates is that they are passed and they are in place right away. So that way, you know, your governing board would pass this rate, and then when there is a low water situation, the rates automatically kick in. So the town council or the HOA board does not have to meet and specially pass these at that time. They will automatically kick in when these low supply or drought conditions are in effect. So those are some examples of the different types of rate structures that are out there. So we have one more poll question for you that Tess will get launched for us here. And what we're curious about is just based on what you've heard, do you feel like your current rate structure is encouraging conservation? So we'll give you a minute to answer that question.
Yeah, great. Looks like we have about half of our attendees voting. We're going to give you just a couple more seconds. So if you haven't voted yet, please do so. All right, I'm going to keep this poll open for about 3 more seconds. Okay, I'm closing this poll. Great. So it looks like of our water systems, the majority, 32%, say yes, they do feel that their rate structure encourages conservation. 30% say no, and 7% are not sure.
Well, if you're in those latter two categories and you're a small water system, we have some free technical assistance available. And if you'd like us to look at your rate structure and your usage, we're happy to do that. And there'll be a chance to sign up for that at the end of the webinar. So I just want to close with 2 points here. One is to talk a little bit about this idea of competing objectives, and then I want to run through some tools and resources for you. And we'll save the last 10 minutes of the hour for questions, so please do go ahead if you've not already. Start thinking about a question or submit it through the questions box on your GoToWebinar screen. We'll get to those in a few minutes. But obviously, you know, as we talked about with the pricing approaches and the non-pricing approaches, that there can be some tension between encouraging conservation and full cost recovery. So if you are looking to sell less water, and again, if a lot of your water revenue is based on volumetric charges, that obviously can cut into full cost recovery. And as mentioned, if you want to shift the majority of the cost to the volumetric side and off of the base charge, that can have an impact on your revenue stability. So that's a tension that we see there. Another is between encouraging conservation and maintaining affordability, because in many of these examples, whether it be increasing block or high uniform rates or seasonal rates, in all of those cases, maintaining affordability could be a risk, because you're essentially saying that we're setting up a rate structure where we're going to increase the cost of volumetric water, we're going to potentially decrease the base charge a little bit. And while that does give a customer more control over his or her bill, depending on how high those rates are, you know, if you're in a place charging $13, $14, $15 per 1,000 gallons, even if you're the widow using 2,000 gallons a month, you're going to have a not unsubstantial bill. And there are some cases where we see increasing block setup where the first block is just a couple thousand gallons and it's a relatively low price, and then the subsequent blocks are much higher prices, so there are some ways around that. In terms of business-friendly practices, oftentimes we want to give businesses a chance to access water at a discounted rate or at a lower rate, especially at higher volumes of use, which can obviously conflict with encouraging conservation. And so sometimes we see systems set up a commercial rate and a residential rate that might be different, or there are kind of strict allocations between the two categories. So again, there's ways to handle this. And then the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of full cost recovery is, you know, we're obviously focusing on drinking water, but many of you have sewer and wastewater as well. And if you do switch to having a separate outdoor meter for that irrigation water, and previously that outdoor usage was included on the indoor meter, you may not end up charging sewer for those outdoor gallons, because the idea is they would not be going into your sewer system, and therefore your sewer revenue may go down as well. So just something to keep in mind. And again, this is rate setting and meeting these objectives is really more painful art than it is science. And we would be really happy to chat with you and talk to you about what you're trying to do with the rates and help you kind of see different structures and how they could be used to encourage conservation. So to close out, just a couple of good resources. One is Designing Rate Structures That Support Your Objectives, a guide that my colleague Shadi Eskaf wrote about 10 years ago. And it was originally written for North Carolina, but does well anywhere in the country. And this is one we use pretty heavily in our work, so encourage you to check this guide out, which you can download off of our project website or off of the UNC website for free. UNC also has a spreadsheet tool, a water and wastewater rates analysis model, where you can enter in your current rate structure and some information about your customers and their usage, and then some alternative rate structures, including those geared towards conservation, and it will show you whether or not those rates that you're setting will help you recover the right amount of revenue, and ties back into that full cost recovery idea. We also have a water utility revenue risk assessment tool where you put in some information on your rate structure, residential customer usage profile, weather patterns, and some assumptions about price elasticity. So as prices go up, how much does usage goes down? And the tool will show you kind of the proportion of revenues that could be lost due to changes in water use patterns, whether that be due to rate increases, weather changes, or a significant or important conservation effort tied to a drought. And here's a little example of what the output of that tool would look like. Again, as part of that one-on-one help, we can help you with any of these tools. And one last tool I want to mention, though it is not a free tool, it's available for Alliance for Water Efficiency members, but it is a sales forecasting and rate model tool, similar to the ones described earlier, but this allows you to put multiple scenarios in, which is always encouraged when you're looking at changing your rates, to do a lot of different scenarios and a lot of what-ifs, and it's a really good tool for all of that kind of use. So if you happen to be an Alliance for Water Efficiency member, please go ahead and check out this tool. And then finally, I wrote a blog post a couple years ago that you'll get a link to on key financial benchmarks for water systems, talking about how we measure conservation signals through the work that we do, and in particular through the rates dashboards that we have. So with that, we've got a couple of polling questions to wrap things up, and we want to take questions from the audience. So again, if you have questions and haven't submitted them already, please go ahead and submit them through the questions box, and we have about 7 or 8 minutes to take those until the top of the hour.
Great, thanks, Glenn. I am going to send out just a poll quickly while people are putting in their questions. So just go ahead and answer this poll quickly for us. It's about our blog, and if you'd like to subscribe. Just a couple more seconds here. All right, great. Looks like most people have responded. Okay, and then one more poll until we get to our questions. Make sure that you are also submitting those if you have them. This question, Glenn alluded to this earlier, but are you interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance for your small water system? Let us know here. We will be sure to follow up with you on that.
And again, this technical assistance is part of the same grant from EPA that allows us to do today's webinar, so it is no cost to you as a system other than your time to work with us.
It looks like most of you have voted. I'm going to give you a few more seconds just to get your response in. Okay. All right, great. And so now we can go ahead and get to our questions. We do have a question, Glenn. The first question pertains really to irrigation rates. And the question is, to have irrigation rates indicates that there are separate irrigation meters. Wouldn't that increase operational cost in reading and maintenance? And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for whoever submitted that. So absolutely, you know, if you are going to have well, let's look at the first scenario. So you will have an irrigation meter that is on the same potable water line that the household meter or business meter would be on. Yes, you are now doubling, or maybe not doubling, but increasing the number of meters within your water system. Those meters will have to be read. Those meters will have to be maintained over time. We know that meters over time tend to run slower, so again, this meter charging a higher rate, it's probably even more of an incentive now. So there are operational costs in addition to there, and again, it depends to some extent on whether you have radio read meters or manual read meters, whether meters in your area tend to last for a long time, or maybe you're in an area with salt sea air in the area where they don't last as long, or some other atmospheric condition that causes them not to last as long. So absolutely. I mean, I think if you're setting up that type of program, there are going to be those initial costs, both on the upfront capital side, but then on the O&M side as well. And you do have to decide whether or not it's important to do that. Now, some of the reasons that we see systems want to have these irrigation meters is that, especially with the radio read meters, if there is a drought or a low water supply situation, they can actually remotely shut those meters down. So that way it would actually prevent people from being able to do outdoor irrigation. And that's another potential reason that systems may want them. Now, obviously, for systems that run separate lines to bring non-potable water for irrigation, whether that be to a single large customer. The university where I'm sitting right now has those lines from our water system. They just serve the university. Or for all customers, these kind of gray water lines, obviously then you're looking at a much more significant capital investment. So I think with the irrigation rates, whether or not they make sense really depends on doing some number crunching and seeing what that additional capital and O&M costs would be versus the rate benefit that you would get out of it. And again, to consider what the potential impact might be on your sewer bill if you have one that is tied to water usage.
Great. Okay, so our next question, what suggestions do you have to eliminate leaks of individual fixtures inside private residences or businesses?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and I think again, one of the things we're starting to see with the types of meters, for example, that are not just radio read, where you drive the car down the street and it picks up the data once a month, but the ones that are relayed through the cell network, where you're getting 15-minute increment or 1-hour increment readouts. A little of this may be in notifying customers if you see a sudden or surprising shift in the usage of water. And I think as technology gets better and there will be smartphone apps for this, people will get notices automatically. I have a friend with a solar panel, for example, and he got a text message one day automatically sent that said, we think your solar panel has leaves on it. And sure enough, he went outside and there were leaves on top of the solar panel, and it was able to tell based on the time of year and the weather conditions and the output that something was blocking the panel from working. So technology may be a option for us here. We do see some examples with water systems, especially with lower income customers, that the water system will actually go into private residences and businesses and do repairs themselves or have a set of contractors. But obviously, if you're going to do that, have a chat with your attorney about the legal implications of just putting somebody in on private property and all of those kinds of deals. But I think that a lot of people understand, hey, the line coming from the meter box into my house through the front yard, if that breaks, it could be 50,000 gallons, 100,000 gallons in a month. I think fewer people really understand that a dripping faucet or shower head or a toilet where, I mentioned my toilet that was leaking, it's one where if you don't jiggle the handle the right way, the flap doesn't close. That little leaks like that can use a tremendous amount of water, and I certainly found that out when I got the bill. But if there had been some more regular monitoring of the water use, which at the time we had a manual read meter at our house, it wasn't possible. But if I had known that sooner, I might have been able to have found that leak and fixed it. So some of it is going to be customer education as well.
We have one last question, and I think that's all we'll have time for. But how would you set a conservation rate structure for a system that has less than 15 billable connections, but may have at times more than 25 full-time residents where the system doesn't support the treatment?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I think for very, very small systems, and that's why we do the polling question earlier in the webinar about, where does conservation rank in your priorities? I think when we do this in workshops, we have a question of kind of pick your number one priority, and in a lot of cases, in almost universally, it's full cost recovery, or in a few cases, it's affordability. It's only in very rare cases that it's conservation. And so I think for very small systems, you almost have to be more concerned about the full cost recovery. And in that case, you may naturally have a conservation rate because without that many connections, your uniform volumetric charge or increasing block volumetric charge may be higher. But what we sometimes see for really small systems is that they just do, $20 a month for every customer. They don't meter. It's too expensive to meter or have to deal with that kind of issue. And so in those cases, maybe switching to metering and a volumetric charge, or, in some cases that's set up because you're under the purview of a utility commission and you don't want to have to go in for rate cases. So we do see some examples of metering and reporting usage to customers, even if it's still a flat rate. But if you're not metering for usage as a system that size, you'll probably want to switch to metering if you want to encourage conservation. And it may be that your rates are high enough already, but full cost recovery and affordability may end up crowding out conservation for a lot of those really small systems. And again, if you're interested, my email's up on the screen. Just shoot me a message, and we'll be happy to kind of crunch some numbers and see if we could come up with something that would work for you.
Great. One last order of business. I am going to be sending out an evaluation link in your chat. So take a look at that if you can. And other than that, Glenn, if you have any closing comments, feel free.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. And this is obviously a pretty high overview of non-pricing and pricing approaches. I think what we'll do, because we're getting a lot of interest in this particular topic, is we will probably do some subsequent webinars later this year on the non-pricing approaches in a little more depth and show you a lot of good examples we've found from small systems around the country. And then I will also plan to do another one on the pricing side where we'll show you some examples of actually putting the numbers in and what you would need to charge to be able to do both pricing and full cost recovery. So be on the lookout for those in the next couple months.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye. Let us know if you need anything via email, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.